Okay, well thanks for that. Sometimes have to remind myself, when you've been somewhere for a long time, as I was at the TCPA, you have to remind yourself that you've moved on as well. So I've answered the phone a couple of times saying hello TCPA and had to correct myself. I'm going to talk about climate change adaptation. I'm going to look at some of the techniques and the approaches that we can take to deal with adaptation. Please don't be too put off by the title of my presentation, which is Theory. It's not going to be so bad. Hopefully it won't be heavy. I'm going to take you through quite a few case studies, but when I say case studies, it's really just showing these as examples of what can and what has been done. And I think we're going to hear more from Ian later about a more worked up, thorough example. So, can I just ask how many of you were here, I think it was about a month ago now, to hear about mitigation? Good, well, that's about half of you. This does follow on from where I left off, although it has to be said, it does stand alone. And if you do notice one or two slides, I promise you I'll say different words to them. I hope I will anyway. If anybody, as we go through, wants points of clarification or any burning questions that can't wait, then please do feel free to interrupt. I don't mind at all. So, the reason why we're here is climate change. And I think what's becoming increasingly clear as we start to understand better the science of climate change is that whatever we do in terms of reducing our emissions today, it's going to have very little effect on the climate for another 30 or 40 years' time. And that's because of the inherent inertia in the climate system. It's a lazy system, and it takes a long time for the CO2 or other greenhouse gases to work through the system and to actually affect it. But beyond that time, anything we do today to reduce our emissions will help the climate and will make the job of adapting in the future that bit easier. So we have to adapt today because we're locked into at least 30 to 40 years worth of climate change. And what's important to remember, mainly because of the big concentrations of people, in terms of climate change adaptation, it'll affect our urban areas more than it will affect our rural areas, just because adaptation affects people, species and so on to a greater extent. So, start by looking at what we're going to see from climate change. We're going to see higher temperatures, and that will bring with it health implications. If we look at the 2003 heat wave, that brought with it an estimated 2,000 excess deaths in the UK alone, many more across Europe. The civil unrest in Paris a few years ago, many of you might remember that during the summer, has been attributed in part to the high temperatures that they had around that time as a trigger for civil unrest. And I think if you look back in history, it's often been very hot periods of the summer that have triggered riots and so on. The image there at the top, if you can see that, basically that shows the difference in temperature between the pre and preceding years around 2003. So the darker the colour, the bigger the temperature difference away from that average. So you can see that the UK, where we saw 2,000 excess deaths, was nothing compared to that central landmass across Europe there. But also what's very worthwhile remembering is that the hot summers that we're experiencing today are likely by mid-century to be considered cool summers. And that's quite an important reminder of the challenge that we've got to face. The second element is flooding, and generally speaking, this year has been an obvious exception. We're going to see lower rainfall in the summer, and this is going to bring with it issues for quality, water quality, but also for irrigation. But when that rain does come, it's going to be more intense, and we've seen that in the flooding events around Carlisle. We've seen many of them this year, and so on. Very heavy rainfall, which our drainage systems can't cope with. This rainfall, generally speaking, though, will be higher in the winter periods, but it will also be generally more unsettled, so we'll get freak events like we got this summer. This is, according to the scientists, quite a classic sign of the sorts of things we're going to see in the future. And there are real issues here with insurance. Flooding scenarios by the 2080s put damages somewhere between £500 million and £27 billion a year, according to the Foresight Project. The third issue is changes in soil moisture content. We're likely to see a lowering of moisture. London is expected by the middle of the century to be 60% drier. And I'll come back to this later because that's got real issues for the stability of the land, particularly in places like London where you've got a prevalence of clay-based soils, which can shrink and swell, causing real problems. And the fourth issue is sea level rise. And we're expected to see somewhere between 0.5 metre and 1.5 metres by the end of the century. And that varies again around the country, with the bigger problem happening around the southeast of the country, mainly because, for two reasons. One is you've got a funneling effect down the channel there, whereby you've got more prominence of more likelihood of storm surges and so on, which adds to the other problem, which is the whole of the UK is tipping into the sea. It's kind of the northwest or the northeast is going up and the southeast is going down, and that's a hangover from the last ice age. So together with around about 1 millimetre a year of sea level rise, you've got about 1 millimetre a year of sinkage as well, so doubling effectively. So we've got some big issues, and that's why when I was at the TCPA, we produced this guide, and there's plenty of them around. They're freely available, so if you want to take one for yourselves and for anyone else you think should be interested in this, feel free to do so. This guide, it was a response to the fact that climate change is happening, the responses need to happen now, and many of the responses can come through the built environment, and planning has a big role to play in dealing with that. So this takes the reader through some of the issues and aims to communicate the importance of climate change. What it also shows is how climate change adaptation can be integrated into the planning and the design of new and existing communities. And it looks at how adaptation and the approaches we need to take are influenced by geographical location. So the sorts of techniques that we need, for instance, to deal with heat, and I'll come back to this more in a moment, is going to be greater in the southeast than it is in Scotland. So it considers these kind of different geographical changes, but it also considers the location of developments, the techniques that we can use to lower temperatures or avoid flooding and so on in an area like this, a relatively dense urban area, are going to be different to the sorts of things we can do in a less dense suburban location or urban-rural fringe location. So it looks at the different roles of planning, planners, communities, stakeholders, delivery bodies and so on, and how these can work together, and draws on a range of case studies. So what I'm going to do for the majority of this presentation is to go through the different risk areas, which are high temperatures, water availability and quality, flooding, and land stability. And unfortunately, there was a great image there, but it's not there. I've had a look through this before, and it's the only one that isn't there. But it's, if you have a look in here, if you do want to look at what I'm talking about, it's page 19. It's this image. So I'm going to look at the different risk areas, and I'm going to look at some different techniques that have been adopted around the world to address those. Starting with high temperatures. As I've already alluded to, the imperative for change for temperature is greatest in the southeast of the country, where temperatures are already warmer than they are the further north you go. And the urban heat island effect, whereby temperatures within and above urban areas are greater than those in the surrounding rural areas, is a problem that we're increasingly starting to see. If anyone spent time in London during 2003, 4 and 5, I mean this year was a bit different, but generally speaking you had at least a few weeks where temperatures were really quite unpleasant, particularly if you're using transport and so on. And this sort of effect is going to become much more intense as time goes by. And I've got some figures to illustrate that a bit later on. But there are a number of approaches we can take to managing these. And this document takes you through those on a sliding scale from the conurbation scale and the catchment scale down through neighbourhoods to the individual building. As I say, there are different approaches we can use at those different spatial scales. I'm not going to go through all of these, I'm just going to pick on a couple of those. But we can use techniques such as solar control, so shading, orientation of the building towards or away from south, depending on whether you're looking for heat, to trap that heat, or whether you're trying to avoid that heat. Particularly in offices, it's important to try and reduce your heating load. But also the building morphology can influence the amount of heat that you're getting within a building. The image at the bottom there is a photo from Bratislava, and what that shows, you probably won't be able to see it very, very clearly, but behind these large trees where the flats are shaded, most of the windows don't have air conditioning units. When you get outside of those, there's one just there, just beyond the shading of the tree, you start to get air conditioning units on the side of the flats, just showing that the impact that you can make by shading in terms of temperature within the building as well as outside in the street. The other issue is green space, and it's important to consider water availability, the length of the growing season, changing suitability of different species. All of these are going to be affected by climate change. And what's important, it's not just about shading when we talk about trees and green space. Anything that's green and growing is evapotranspiring and effectively air conditioning the immediate surroundings. But in order for that effect to continue to work, you've got to be irrigating that land or those trees. So it's important that when you're relying perhaps in the future on using green spaces to reduce temperatures in the urban heat island, that we also remember that we need to keep that watered. If grassland starts to burn off, then suddenly the effect changes from a cooling effect to a heating effect, because it acts just like a concrete or other hard surface. The top image there is of an imaginatively titled council house in Australia, and these have used dark-coloured air abstraction ducts to avoid heat within the building, so that it then rises and up out of ducts at the top of the building. They've also used planting filters to filter sunlight and to provide shade. And within the building, again, they've used chilled beams, which are solid beams with water or some cooling agent going through those, which can provide a cooling effect. Moving on to flooding, some of the risks, as I've talked about earlier, will increase over time. Increasingly within our urban areas, as people are having more than one car in a family, or for other reasons, are paving over the front gardens of their homes, meaning that where before you had a surface that water could percolate through and find its way back into the natural watercourse, thereby avoiding going into man-made drainage channels, we're now starting to see all the water going straight into the drainage channels. Most of our drainage systems are not designed for very intense weather events. Many of our drainage systems are Victorian or even older, meaning that these get overloaded very quickly, resulting in flash flooding, which, one example a few years ago in London, most of the mainline stations in central London had to be closed because of a flash flood. And that sort of thing is likely to become more and more frequent. So we need to think about the little things that we're doing, but also the big things. In the catchment scale, we need to think about how we drain farmland and large housing developments or communities, so that as far as possible we're mimicking the natural drainage systems. So again, how can we manage these at the different scales? The image at the top there, it doesn't really say a great deal, unfortunately, but this is taken from the ESPAS project, which is a European funded project involving the likes of Hampshire County Council and others. But they developed 13 different models for storage and management of water, emphasising that there's a multifunctional element to land use. So we don't have to ensure that all of our land large areas of land are kept for drainage all of the year, because we're not going to need it all of the year. We can use them for maybe leisure activities and so on. So there are different uses that we can use through the year, and the ESPAS project has helped to bottom out some of those issues. The bottom image there is of Abbots Hall Farm in East Anglia, where the old hard defences, sea defences, have been breached, and they've developed, they've allowed the land behind here to regenerate as natural salt marsh, and that itself has a natural flood prevention effect. And that sort of thing is increasingly being considered. Certainly I know Faber Monsell have been involved in a few projects like this. Around the world we're starting to see a recognition that actually our natural processes work more effectively than our more modern processes. Other techniques are sustainable drainage systems, which mimic drainage in urban areas. We can use green roofs. We can raise floor levels where flooding is unavoidable, and similarly we can use freestanding flood barriers. Again, in some places flooding is likely to be unavoidable. The third risk area is water resources and quality. And the changing patterns of rainfall is going to have a significant impact on our resources and on the quality of those resources. We're going to see more drought periods as we get drier summers, and low river flows that come from that will be less able to dilute pollutants, with a knock-on effect for the water quality. It can also bring about eutrophication, where plants, there's an excess of nitrogen in a smaller quantity of water, encouraging massive plant growth, which can clog up streams and rivers, causing fish death and so on. And while managing water quality and resources is already a current priority, what climate change is going to do is put pressure on these systems and these established processes and procedures that we have, and will need to be looked at again in the future. So we can manage these again in a range of ways, from the extreme perhaps, which is xeriscaping. The image at the top there is New Mexico. And what they've done there, through water shortages and growth pressures, actually similar in some respects to the southeast of England, what they've done is use creative use of planting, which uses very little water. So you can get the greenery in there, but it requires very little water. On the other hand, the bottom image there is of Red Kite House, which is the Environment Agency's headquarters somewhere in Berkshire. I'm not entirely sure where. But what they've done there, by capturing the water that falls in and around the building, they've actually met 40% of their annual water demand. And the overspill from this goes into a tank underneath the car park, which then gradually is released so it can flow back to the natural water course, again mimicking the natural flow of the water. And the final risk area is ground conditions. As I mentioned earlier, ground conditions are going to be affected, particularly in those areas where you've got clay soils, which can shrink and swell according to the water content. And when in places like London, which has got a very large proportion of older buildings, often with very shallow foundations, again built for a different era, we're going to find that changes in the stability of the land caused by climate change is going to have an effect on the stability of those buildings themselves, and also our infrastructure in the ground, our pipes carrying water, sewage, gas, perhaps heat, as we start to develop combined heat and power networks. So, while wetter winters will contribute to the risk of heave, drier summers will contribute to subsidence. So these two things are already estimated to have cost the economy around £3 billion over the last 10 years. If you look to the future, these are likely to be significantly greater. So, managing these, a variety of approaches have been adopted. In the Isle of Wight, they have a great risk of landslides there. So what they've done, the local authority there has done, is to develop a strategy which identifies the current risks and sets out procedures for helping sort those out. And they're now working on a European funded project which will help them to assess the future risks based on climate change and help them to find different ways of dealing with those. And this could include vegetation management, regrading or reinforcing of slopes, It can also involve deeper or stronger foundations, and also control over the moisture within the soil, so we can rehydrate it if need be. So those are there are some of the options and the techniques that we can use, but we need some way of coordinating this activity. And planning has a crucial role to play in those. Local government has a crucial role, but planning within that has an important role, in the same way as when we need to deal with climate change mitigation. Many of the effects that we've talked about and the techniques involve the built environment, and so planning has some kind of control over that. We're starting to see a growing amount of relevant legislation and policy to support these, from the regional, from the EU level down to the local. So in the UK, we've got the UK Climate Change Programme. We've got a draft, and hopefully very soon, climate change planning policy statement, which will put climate change at the heart of the planning system, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And at some point, we're going to get a climate change adaptation policy framework, which will provide a framework for policy making. But the real issue is making this happen through regional and local plan making and action. So we need to, as we all know, buildings have a long lifespan. Most of our buildings, say our commercial buildings, tend to be built with a 60-year lifespan in mind. Our homes certainly will last a lot longer than that, many of them decades, centuries, even longer than that, particularly because we're not replacing our housing stock at any great rate. To an even greater extent, our urban areas, our neighbourhoods in which those buildings sit, change even slower, and those will be around for centuries in many cases. So in order to affect those, in order to have an impact on those and remodel those for climate change, we need to focus on the opportunities that arise. And I think the 240,000 homes per year, new homes per year target that the Housing Green Paper earlier this year recommended is certainly an opportunity that we should be looking at. The government over the last, since 2003 rather, has introduced a number of initiatives, from the Sustainable Communities Plan, which introduced the 4 southeast growth areas and aims to build 200,000 new homes on top of plan provision by 2016, within sustainable communities, as they term it, so including jobs, associated services, infrastructure and so on. Together then with the other side of the communities plan, which is the housing market renewal pathfinder areas in the north of England, which is helping to revive the fortunes of communities that are facing housing market collapse. These two things offer us opportunities for new build to incorporate adaptation, but also up in the north and the Midlands to remodel our existing communities to take into account the need for robust communities in the long term. More recently, and I think on the basis that the government realised that building an awful lot more houses than we are already is a very hard job, they also introduced the growth points, which aims to be local authority-led urban extensions to existing communities, and more recently still, the eco-towns. At the moment, they're looking for at least 10 new freestanding settlements all across England that will provide at least 5,000 homes per eco-town. Together then with the ongoing emphasis on the urban renaissance, renewing and bringing life back into our existing communities, and urban intensification. So all of these different initiatives and approaches give us the opportunity to consider climate change adaptation. So there are a number of issues which planning is going to need to consider when we're trying to deal with adaptation. The first is understanding what is appropriate for your particular location. And in order to do that, we need an evidence base. So we need to understand what our baseline, our underlying vulnerabilities are in a community to climate change, be that flooding or excess heat and so on. And while in terms of understanding our CO2 emissions, we're starting now to get a number of tools that will help local authorities and planners to do that, For adaptation, it's that bit harder because we've got a wide range of different vulnerabilities and they're often very local in nature. So whereas CO2 emissions will affect the whole of a particular locality, flooding may only affect a little part of it, and you may get a bit of excess heat here and so on. So we need to find ways of understanding these baselines and using those then to develop targets and develop our policy making. And I was involved in a project called ASCU, Adaptation Strategies for Climate Change in the Urban Environment. And much of the research, this was a university research-led project, but much of the research was used as the basis for this guide. And for the first time it started to quantify what some of the effects are going to be on urban areas of climate change. And what they tried to do was to develop a risk assessment framework which would help local authorities to understand what the issues are for their particular areas. And that was based around this risk triangle. And there were 3 elements around that triangle which need to be there in order for there to be a risk. So the hazard is the extent and the probability of a hazard such as flooding occurring. And we need to combine that then with exposure to that hazard. So is there actually a population there that will be affected by it? Because if it's just affecting some fields, then it's not such an issue as if it's affecting large parts of an urban area. And the third element is vulnerability. So what are the vulnerable groups within that exposed area? So is there a prevalence of older people or very young people who will not be able to help themselves if there's a flood or if there's excess heating? And that then, we can overlay that on a GIS base. Increasingly we're starting to see Google Maps providing a free and accessible way of doing this. A really good opportunity, I think, for a more inclusive approach to planning for both emergencies. So you can use this evidence to plan your emergency services and the location of your emergency services, but also to underlie your policy making through your Sustainable Communities Plan or your planning, your core strategies, development plan documents and so on. A second issue is that of skills. If planners are increasingly putting these sort of policies and these approaches into their core strategies and their development plan documents, we have to ask ourselves, do we have the skills to do it? And I think at the moment, no, we don't, because this is very new. We're starting as a profession to understand that climate change mitigation is a problem and that energy is one of the solutions to that, but adaptation is much lower down the agenda. But it is something I think that is rapidly growing rapidly moving up the agenda, principally because many of the techniques that we can adopt are very positive. So it's about planting trees and green spaces, which also contribute to a good quality of life. And the third issue is that of conflicts and synergies between different approaches. Conventional wisdom has it that in order to reduce our CO2 emissions and thereby help climate change, we need to be densifying our cities, making them more compact so that public transport, for instance, becomes more viable, district heating networks become more viable, and so on. But the problem is the urban heat island. So we're starting to see this increase in temperatures across some of our cities. And this has increasingly been recognised as a problem in a number of cities. The ASCU project quantified some of the effects by using Greater Manchester as a case study. This isn't the best picture of Greater Manchester, but my artwork isn't the best. But what it shows is that historically, the last 50 years or so, average maximum surface temperatures in Manchester have been around 31 degrees Celsius. By the 2080s, under a high emission scenario, that's likely to be around 35 degrees Celsius. And that doesn't seem like a big change. But if you look at the local variations, today our parks, green spaces and areas around the city are around 18.5 degrees Celsius. That's average maximum surface temperatures. If you go into the high density residential areas and the city centre, it's over 12.5 degrees Celsius hotter than those park areas. So a big difference between different parts of your urban area, with then your lower density, medium density areas around 6 degrees Celsius cooler. Now if we go forward to the 2080s, we can see that our parks are that bit hotter, over 21.5 degrees Celsius, and our denser urban areas are now nearly 14 degrees Celsius hotter than those parks. And again, a correspondingly higher but cooler temperature in the low density areas. But what's interesting is what happens if we add 10% green cover, and I don't think that's scientifically 10%, but roughly 10% to the green cover in our high density areas. What we can do is to keep temperatures at or around today's temperatures until at least mid-century. Now if we go further north up into, say, Edinburgh, then those temperatures, we're not going to have much of a problem with the urban heat island this century. But if we come down here, these differences in temperature are going to be much starker. Now if we decrease our tree cover in high density areas by 10%, then we're likely to see an 8 degrees Celsius increase over what we would otherwise have seen. And that takes us into the realm of the 40-degree city for parts of the summer in large parts of the country. And the responses to that, I think, are likely to be that people will move out of our high-density areas, thereby undermining very effective policy initiatives such as the Urban Renaissance, or people will install air conditioning. And that, of course, has an impact on climate change, puts out more CO2. They're also very energy intensive, and they're also very noisy, and they throw out heat. So if you've got a flat, a high density block of flats, and you've got someone here with an air conditioning unit, it's throwing out heat, contributing further to the heat island effect. It's also very noisy. So if Mr. Bloggs living next door couldn't afford to put an air conditioning unit on, they're not going to be able to open their window because it's hotter and it's too noisy. So, as ever with these things, it's the poorest in society who are likely to be most adversely affected. So it's in our interest to consider these things. And design has a really important role to play in this. What I'm not saying here is that we shouldn't be building to high densities. High density has an important role to play, and it has its place. But we need to think very carefully about what the implications of that are, and we need to think about how we can use design such as trees, planting, green roofs and so on to help us create a robust urban environment that's going to remain a desirable place for people to live into the future. And of course in all of this we have to capture the rainfall on our cities so that we can irrigate that. We're in a slightly advantageous situation in some of our cities, particularly Manchester, where all the heavy industry is closed down and their water table under the city is actually rising because there's very little abstraction now. So we've got a resource there that we could use to irrigate. It may not be good enough quality for drinking water, but it's certainly good enough to irrigate green spaces. So this leaves us, I think, with big questions about the future desirability of our urban areas, but it also gives us big opportunities. I think this brings us back to Ebenezer Howard, who over 100 years ago said, "Let the countryside invade the town." And I think that message is still very relevant today. His reasons for promoting this garden in the city may have been very different. It was about social issues, but creating the places that people want to live and work, in which biodiversity can thrive and which provide the conditions for cities to adapt over the long term, are often the same thing. Thank you.